Hi, I'm John Sauvé, and this is Art and Design. Today my guest is Jim Kelly. Jim, thanks for coming on the show.
Glad to be back.
Jim, when you were starting out as a short story writer, you were teaching at the time and reaching out to people that that impressed you and that you wanted to emulate. Can you tell a little bit about that time period and what your approach was to your own education?
Well, after I graduated from college from Oakland University, I was a conscientious objector. So I spent 2 years in a Detroit hospital, and abruptly, conscientious objectors were released on the same day, and it was in August. So I said, yikes, what am I going to do now? And so I called the University of New Hampshire and said, can I be an English major? I want to read books again. Went east, got a teaching degree, and was working in the mountains of Vermont as a teacher. What I really wanted to do was be a short story writer. So I would teach all day, then on the weekends I would write my stories, send them out. That's when you had to put them in an envelope and send them out. And I got all these rejections. So I said, I know I want to write stories. I know I can tell stories, but why don't they work on the page? So I started to write to writers that I admired. One of them was Nelson Algren, who had written The Man with the Golden Arm, which won the first National Book Award in 1949. And to my surprise, a world-class writer wrote back. And I would write to him and say, what do you think about this? What do you think about that? And he said, keep your day job, but keep sending me your stuff. And so eventually I started calling him, and he would tell me stories about his friends. I'd say, well, what was Richard Wright like? You guys were in Chicago in the 30s working for the WPA. And he would say, well, it was a great time to be a writer, but nobody would hire you except the government. So we went around, we wrote histories of little towns, and on the side, we wrote novels and short stories. So Wright wrote Black Boy, which made his career. Algren wrote his first couple of novels. And I pressed him and said, well, how did you get started as a writer? How did you go from being a college guy, like I am right now, or just was, to being somebody who could be taken seriously on the page? And he was very funny about that. He said, when I graduated, it was 1931 or 2, I got a card that said, this allows you to be a writer and you can get a job in a newspaper or magazine, but it wasn't worth the paper it was printed on. So he rode the rails and realized that what he needed was experience. He saw misery coast to coast. He saw all kinds of things. And he said what he did was to write to his older sister, who he really admired. She was a school teacher, and he would try and write through the voices of the people that he was seeing, hobos and people like that. So he wrote this one letter, which was imagining he was this person who he had met on the riding the rails. And his sister wrote back and said, Nelson, you're a writer. And so that's what he told me to do. He said, forget trying to sound like somebody that you admire. Don't try and sound like Faulkner, all these people you tell me you like, or Mark Twain or Stephen Crane. He said, when you sit at the page, you need to be able to move people. You need to be able to make them feel something. So forget the fancy stuff. Just try and move them by telling a story that's compelling. And it took me 20 years to take his advice because I kept trying to be fancy guy. And I wanted to sound here like Dylan Thomas or there like somebody else. But his advice was the best I ever got. And it was eventually, after years of rejections, and I may have told you this story before, I quit writing and sending stuff out. I just started to write for myself. And the notion was, if nobody wants it, I still want to tell stories. I'll take Algren's advice. So I'd sit barefoot, I like to slap my feet on the floor, and I like to whack paper with an actual typewriter. I like to see things pop up in the page. And I just started to write for sound, John, for my ear. And it was like play. And so what I would do was I would write a sentence 20 or 30 times, and eventually, if it sounded right, I would then just follow the sound, and when the sound quit, the story was over. No more labored beginnings, what's a brilliant first sentence, what's a catchy ending. It was all about just a voice, which was Algren's prompt to me. So I wrote 4 or 5 pieces like that about being a conscientious objector. And my middle son was home for summer, and he was doing a summer job, and my wife and my oldest son were away. And at night, I'm cooking for him, and he says, "Hey, Dad, you haven't read to me for a while. What are you writing? You know, what's a dad to do?" I said, "Do you want to hear my stuff?" So I ran upstairs, and I got this segmented thing, and I read the first one. Now, my son's an artist, and he's got a wonderful ear and a wonderful eye. He's a ceramicist, but he picks up on stuff very quickly. And he said, "That's like a song." And you could have knocked me down. I said, "Yeah, it's a sound." And I told him my notion about just play. This language should be play. And he said, "Do you have any more?" And so after that, I read him the others, and that was the first publication I ever got. I quit trying to be labored. It'd take me 20 years to do what Algren told me to do when I was 22. But after all these rejections and only being able to write like limited time on weekends, because I was always working, that was my breakthrough. Long way around, and I'm nobody's model for how to become a writer. But it's wonderful when you have a mentor who tells you something that's true, gives it to you straight, saying what you're doing now doesn't work, but there's pieces here that suggest it might in the future. And so that's kind of the formative stuff for me. And ever since, I know if I'm writing, John, and I stop trying to be a writer and just try to be a guy telling a story. If I'm true to that and the first sentence works, the rest just follows. But I have to relearn that every time I sit down to write.
Oh boy, a lot to unpack here, Jim. Because you had this life pursuit of being a short story writer and finding your voice. But at the same time, in your career, which you had for a very long period of time, you were doing a lot of writing then.
Yes.
And you were putting stories together then, because I knew you at that time. I always looked to you because you were piecing things together from whatever the goal at hand was into a story format. At least that's how I always looked at you. So this percolation of getting to your writing and getting to finding your voice had many outlets and many different forms and many different things that you were always working on in the background. Is that a fair assessment?
It is, and it's funny. You and I have talked about this in the past. When you're in sales, it's just people talking to people. And when I got a job in a home office of this Fortune 500 company, I was stunned at the people who had been on stages and gave speeches were, as one-on-one people, inarticulate. And my job was to take what they had to say and structure it so that it made sense. And I'd be sitting in rooms with vice presidents, and they were scattered, diffuse, and I couldn't say, "Oh my." So I would take all these notes, and I would talk to the secretary and say, "Is he always like this? Because I can't use a thing he said." And this one secretary for vice president, in a low voice, leaned down and said, "He won't know the difference. You write it, it'll sound good, he'll be happy." And so that freed me up to just say, I don't have to worry about this. But it was a funny insight into big business, because having come into it as an older guy, I was in my 30s when I became a sales guy, I thought, well, these captains of industry are pithy and insightful and have all kinds of fluency in language. Wasn't true. And then I realized that their speeches were crafted. I wrote a couple, and I would sit in a dark room with one of these characters, in their fancy suits, and they would have a body coach. I would write the language, but they'd have somebody else say, "Hold your hands like this. Now put your hand like this." And they had me write these pauses for authenticity. So you'd be talking about sales figures and competition and this and that, and then you got to move the crowd. So they'd say, "You know what? I'm going to go off script." And they'd throw up their hands and say, "Can I do this?" "Yes. This is just between me and you." And that was all scripted. Even the hand gestures, the timing of the pause, they'd have a clicker. They'd say, to make it really work, that you're really throwing off the script, it's got to be like a 3-beat. And I said, so this is how big business works. It's scripted. It's show business.
Well, and not to distract from what our topic at hand is, but sort of, can you just tell the one story about the guy peeking out his door, waiting for everybody to leave, how he's the last one there? Because we talked about this 30 years ago. It's one of my favorite stories.
So my job, sorry for I got weepy eyes.
No, I'm getting misty too, just here.
I would go to this home office, and you had to wear suits. Even if you got up to the bathroom, you had to wear a suit and tie. And so I would get in early because as a writer, I like to write in the morning. And it was the easiest job I'd ever had in my life. As a salesman, I had to drive 1,000 miles a week in the Upper Peninsula. Here I got to go in and have to write 4 paragraphs. So I'd go in and I'd write, and I'd be done for the day except having to take it around and have it signed by a lawyer, a doctor, and so on. The other guy that was there early was this vice president who was a very strange man. He was a charismatic speaker, and everybody said, wow, this guy is a genius on stage. I would walk through walls because of his energy. He was one-on-one the craziest person I've ever met. I would take something in, and he would have to review it and sign it. And I once took something in, and his eyes, John, were darting back and forth. And I thought, maybe he's just gone mad, he's sick, maybe I don't know. And I said, Jerry, are you okay? I can come back. He said, no, what do you want me to sign? And it was almost like I was nothing in the company. He was up here, but he was distrustful of everything when the door was closed in his office. So I said, well, this is what you asked me to write. I'll leave it. I'll do any changes you want. And later the secretary came back, and there were no changes. Now, at the end of the day, and this was kind of corporate machismo, I always wanted to leave. I wanted to be with my wife and kids, get off the man clothes, get in my blue jeans, and have fun. Well, we were in these pods, our little cubicles, and the lights would go off, and it would be like a city going to sleep. So I'm sitting there I look at my watch, time to go. And I would always take a briefcase. My boss said, I know you always do your work, but take a briefcase so it looks like you're taking stuff home. So I always had an empty briefcase. And I was always leaving it, and the guards would always bring it back. I said, we know it's yours because it was empty. So I have my empty briefcase, and I get up, and I look across, and the only light is from this vice president's office, and he's peeping out. And I thought, I wonder what's going on with him. And so I walked over and said, Jerry, you need anything? He says, no, it's my goal to always be the last person to leave. I said, well, nobody knows. We're all gone. He says, yeah, but I want to be the last person to leave. And I walked out and said, I don't know that big business is for me. If that's important to you, to sit in a chair doing nothing but peeping out a door, well, there's more things to life than that.
Oh, there's another part to this story.
Well, then, as I walked down the hall, I hear giggling. And I said, who would be giggling at a corporate headquarters in the late afternoon or early evening? And it was this vice president skipping and giggling and mugging for nobody in particular. And I said, this is a madhouse. I wonder if anybody on Wall Street would come in and see this and still buy the stock. He was skipping like a madman.
Well, he thought you were gone. He thought he was alone.
He was
right?
solo skipping through this wide, and along the walls are all of these emblems for Fortune 500 and this and that. I said, yikes.
What you just described, though, and you've delved into it a little bit with some of your short stories that dealt with sales.
Yeah.
Your previous book, well, I got to put a shameless plug in for the book.
Pitchman's Blues, Stories of a Salesman's Life. Thank you.
Well, with that, though, is there a way we can cover some of this time period, this firsthand experience? Because what you just described, I would read that all day long.
What I've done, John, in writing stories, I didn't want to write about the kind of sales that I did, which I found boring. So I transposed myself into a traveling salesman in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, which I was for pharmaceuticals, but I turned it into knickknacks and things like that. So I could use voices from people in diners, people in small towns, and then I'd have the person, the narrative voice, question what it is you're doing when you're trying to hustle somebody. And you bring something out and you show it. So I did it with gimcracks and knickknacks and silly things. But essentially I thought it was the same notion. Like, I'm here and I'm trying to get you to do something. You don't know me from Adam, and yet I'm going to try and use language and anything I can do to connect with you to make something happen, to make a sale, make a few bucks. And so that fascinates me. I mean, I did it for 30 years. But it always struck me there was a performative aspect that was, in essence, kind of a con game. Because you'd say, well, this is the director of whatever, I have to act one way. This is somebody else. And what I wound up thinking to myself was, I'm an actor and I'm doing like 20 shows a day for this receptionist, for this person, for that person. And you realize how adaptable you are, and it's somewhat terrifying to say, I can morph into almost anything if I can do what I need to do to make a buck, to be home with my family.
Which is the only way to survive a situation like that, I think. It's a pretty healthy way to do it, especially because there were so many unwritten rules that you had to navigate, and nobody's going to tell you. You have to discover it on your own, because suits don't sit with people from that area over there at lunch.
No.
Yeah.
I once, there was a little town in the Upper Peninsula, and I would go in and see this guy, and he was always obnoxious and giving me grief. He just didn't like people who sold things. And if I didn't stop to see him, he would call the home office and say, how come your guy, it's 4 weeks, he hasn't come in, and so. So I had been in the furthest reaches of the Upper Peninsula. It was going on 4 o'clock. I was running on crazy energy and coffee, and I wanted to get home. And what I used to do when I get home was take off my man clothes, run down to Lake Superior and jump in. And there were these basaltic black rocks, and you'd dive in and it'd be a shock, the water was so cold. I'd swim out, be a little hypothermic, and then I'd lie out on these rocks. The sun's warmth would come through, you'd be alive again, and all the synapses would open. And that was my way of reclaiming myself from the world of sales. I remember going by this guy's place, and I said, if he looks out and sees me and I don't stop, he's going to call and he say, your guy is not respecting me. And there's that one moment where you just decide, who am I? And am I going to be defined by people whose expectations I don't respect, or I'm going to be myself? And these little moments of anarchy, I think, define us. So I paused, I slowed down, and I just loosened the tie and drove home. And when I got back to Marquette, my youngest son, John, was probably 5 or 6. And they knew what I did, he's going to go down and jump in Lake Superior. It was too cold for them to do it. And my oldest son said, I want to come with you. So we went down, and he hung on my neck and crowed like a rooster as we went up and down waves. And then we would lay out on rocks. And to this day, he loves cold water swimming and crowing like a rooster.
But that guy still called the home office.
He did, and when they called me and said, what's the deal, how come you don't respect him? And I said, well, he gives me grief and I don't have to take grief. I'll find other customers. And yet, there's that tension to say, well, I'm doing this for a living, I want to support my family, but how do you maintain who you are and your personal integrity and also put up with stuff that you really shouldn't have to put up with?
Well, I'm going to take it back to Nelson.
Okay.
What's the quote about Chicago?
About
his quote about Chicago.
It's like the ugly woman with her.
I'm trying to remember what it was.
Well, there's a famous quote of his, but I'm not going to be able to get it just right.
Oh, some semblance is going to work.
Well, he said, he wrote a whole book called Chicago City on the Make, and he said it's a hustler's town. It's from the time they stole it from the Potawatomis, the wind has blown across the prairie, and out went the Indians, and in came the neon and the con men and the hustlers. He's a famous quote about what it looks like as a tough town. If you see it in daylight, you don't see it, but if you see it at night under the neon lights where people are stumbling and falling in the alleys, the midnight stuff. But I'm not going to get it just right. And I don't want to cheat him because he's one of my heroes.
Oh, no, but that's good, though, because that gives a semblance, but it also shows why he would be important to you as a writer. And it also seems semi-autobiographical with your sales career.
Definitely.
Couple things about him, too. He was the only guy that Hemingway actually was willing to write a foreword to, right?
It's true, John, because Hemingway stayed in touch with the serious writers from Chicago. And he read them, and if he liked them, he'd write to them, and if he didn't, he wouldn't. He never, to my knowledge, wrote a blurb for anybody, but throughout Nelson Algren's life, he followed him, and he would write to him and say, you know, you're good, keep going. He supported him for Guggenheim. One of the things that he did was, after Algren won the National Book Award in 1949 for The Man with the Golden Arm, it was the very first National Book Award, Hemingway wrote him a long letter, and essentially it was, you can put this on the back of a book. And I only know that because when I used to correspond with him, eventually I got his phone number and we would talk, and he said, he had this gruff voice, he said, let me read this thing that Hemingway sent me. Because I would always ask him, you know, tell me about your writer friends, and really, what was Ernest Hemingway like? And he wrote this beautiful quote comparing Algren to a destroyer, like a battleship, and a boxer, because they both like boxing. And I remember saying, I never knew about this quote, and I've never seen it in any of your books. Why would you not use it? And for a guy who was, you know, a professional writer that would have sold a whole lot of books, he essentially took a line and said, you know what? This is between Hemingway and me. I admire it, I love it, I share it with people I want to share it with, and that's it. And I thought that was a wonderful testament. They had a great writerly support for one another and respect. And after Hemingway died, Algren defended Hemingway against critics who attacked not his art, but Hemingway, the outsized personality.
Well, this time that you're corresponding with them, too, Nelson in the 30s was a lefty, like you, I'm using your term, a lefty. And he probably had a huge file with Hoover.
He did.
And
he was hounded his whole professional career, and they essentially, at the end of his life, stopped him from publishing at the time that I knew him.
Yeah, so this is the 60s when he essentially stopped writing?
He continued to write, but he became more a journalist, John. He could support himself. He wrote wonderful, funny essays. At the end of his life, he was covering the Hurricane Carter trial. That's when I used to call him, and he'd tell me about the trial and how it was going. And he was a funny guy in that he said, I don't get it. Because he interviewed Hurricane Carter a lot, and he had written a book that convinced a lot of people that he was innocent and he was framed. I mean, Bob Dylan wrote a song for him, Mike Nichols was in the audience, he had all these New York celebrities at his retrial, and he didn't take the stand himself. And so he was convicted again. And Algren told me he went into his cell afterwards. He said, you wrote a beautiful book, you proved that you're innocent. Why wouldn't you take the stand? And he said, I thought it was a done deal because I had New York lawyers. And Algren looked at him and said, this is Hackensack, New Jersey. This is a small town. When you show up with fancy New York people and they sit there and you have fancy New York lawyers, the local people are going to hate it. He said, you were done to begin with when you went with that. Celebrities don't buy anything here. And he said, I won't even shake your hand. I'm so mad. He walked out. I don't know if he ever wrote that, but he told me that story.
Very timely topic even for today.
Yeah. And it turns out, eventually, that Hurricane Carter was freed because the same cop who was the detective when he arrested him had been hounding him since he was a teenager. Forged documents, lied about him, And it took years and years and years to do a handwriting analysis to say, wait a minute, this is the same handwriting of the guy that arrested him when he was a rough teenager. And then once he was a middleweight, about to be champion, the guy could take him down and send him away by forging stuff. Yeah, some things don't change.
No. But back to Nelson's, who he was, and he stayed true to that his whole life.
Yes, he did.
And that, as an inspiration, and your own references to how you approach life and the similarities with that. I mean, conscientious objector, that's taking a big risk, and it's also putting yourself at risk and seeing your beliefs through. There's a lot of people, not many people did it to that extent.
It was a tough decision, and at the time,
Yeah.
you know, if you get rejected, I had an uncle who sat me down, and at the time I was full of quotes. I had Tolstoy and Gandhi, and I was a walking quote machine, but I was also like a windy English major, and I was gone in the lingo of it. And I had an uncle who listened. I'd ask him if he would write me a letter in support of being a conscientious objector. And he was a wise guy. He was smoking a pipe, and he listened. He says, I'll write a letter. I don't know why anybody would listen to a flower salesman, but I'll write a letter for you. And then he paused and said, will you go to prison? And all of a sudden, I just stopped dead, jaw dropped. I said, what do you mean go to prison? And he wasn't being rude, or he just said, if you follow the logic of what you're doing, you're going to apply and they're going to reject you. So then you have to decide what you're going to do. Eventually, if you keep appealing and you lose, you can either cave in and become a soldier, run away to Canada, or you can go to prison for 10 years for refusing induction. He knew the sentence. I said, 10 years? 10 years? And to be honest, John, you know, I'd not thought about any of that. It was a heady time where you knew the war was awful. We'd gone to these rallies in Washington and heard great speeches. And I was full of fervor, but all of a sudden I said, would I really go to prison? I appealed. Actually, on my honeymoon, I did the final appeal with a return receipt requested thing. And I was given I finally won, and I served my time, but it was a scary time.
It's a big risk.
And my own father, when I told him I was going to do it, gave me the sport of saying, well, if you're a yellow-bellied coward, you're no son of mine. I said, well, Dad, thank you for your support. So it was, to do that back then, when most of the men that I knew had been veterans in World War II, made you estranged from my father, my uncles. There was this sense of, well, there's nothing here that's ethical, you're just a coward. And they wouldn't sit and talk about it or talk about this particular war. It was, it's time, you're young, you got to go and do it. So it was a tough thing.
Yes, it was. And I want to end with you on an essay that you wrote. Can you do a little quick, can you stay with us and do a reading of that? And I want to say thanks for coming on the show.
I'd be glad to.